Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tariq. I'm a Wellbeing Man and an engagement assistant for Cracks in the Ice online toolkit based at the Matilda Centre for Research in Mental Health and Substance Use, located at the University of Sydney. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's Cracks in the Ice webinar. Before we begin our webinar, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water, and culture. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you are on and pay our respects. I would also like to acknowledge any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are amongst us today. Today's presentation is one in a series of webinars which is running as part of our Cracks in the Ice project. If you haven't already seen the website, I would encourage you to visit www.cracksintheice.org.au, and we welcome any comments or questions you may have, so feel free to get in touch with us at any time. Before I introduce you to today's speakers, I wanted to let you know that as participants, you are in listen-only mode, and this means we can't see or hear you. However, you will notice you have a Q&A button on your dashboard. This is where you can type in any questions you have throughout the webinar and send them through to us. We will then have a question and answer section at the end of our webinar. I would also like to let you know that we will be recording the session today, and we will be making the recordings as well as the slides available to you through the Cracks in the Ice website. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our two speakers, Dave and Mim. David Edwards is a Worimi man who grew up in the Turrbal and Jagera country and now lives in Bundjalung lands of northern New South Wales. David works under the National E-Mental Health in Practice from University of Sydney, University Centre for Rural Health in Lismore, New South Wales, as director of the WellMob website program that provides a digital library of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island specific wellbeing resources. David has a science and Indigenous health promotion background and is dedicated to working with community on looking after country, culture, and community health and employment. David has contributed to the Department of Health, Aging and Communities Digital Health Mental Health Advisory Group and also represents on other national mental health and wellbeing Indigenous governments groups, including Emerging Minds, Beyond Blue, Menzies School Health Research, and Inside Out. Dr Mim Weber is a social worker with 13 years in mental health policy, programs, and training in northern New South Wales, Bundjalung country. Prior to that, she worked in child and family health and eating disorders. She has also worked in South Australia and Pilbara in Western Australia in education, disability health, and welfare positions. She has worked with WellMob since July 2022. Thank you both for joining us. I'll hand it over to you now.
Weeaboo, hello, and Nyata David Edwards, Nyata Nara Marung Baragu Bundjalung. I'm a Worimi fella and as well as the director of the WellMob project. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Bundjalung country. I'm just going to share my screen. Mim and I are going to be presenting to you about the WellMob website, which is an online library of resources for social emotional wellbeing for our First Nations Australians. And we're going to talk to you a little bit about how we use the website, what sort of content's on there. We're going to unpack a little bit beforehand about the social emotional wellbeing model that it's based on. And then we're going to look at some shortcuts for our workforce in using online wellbeing resources. And we'll finish off with a bit of Q&A time. And thanks for all those people that have already logged questions. We'll try and answer those first, and then we'll move on to anything that comes out of the chat. So thanks very much for inviting us, the Matilda Centre. Before we start, we might just let you know we're part of a national consortium called E-Mental Health in Practice, or MPRAC. We're actually based at the University of Sydney's University Centre for Rural Health in Lismore in Bundjalung country. And the consortium's made up of QUT, Menzies School of Health Research, as well as Black Dog Institute. Apologies that my slides seem to be skipping through by themselves. There's some sort of spirit in the keyboard. Before we get into WellMob and using online social emotional wellbeing resources, we need to understand a little bit about this model of social emotional well-being, and it's something we could spend a couple of days talking about. But in summary, we thought it'd be just useful to explain the model as it sort of affects the digital well-being space. And we base the WellMob website on this social emotional well-being model, which is kind of more of a holistic concept of how us First Nations people look at our health and well-being, which varies a little bit from that Western conventional model of health that kind of looks at physical health and mental health as separate entities. I like one of the co-authors of the social emotional well-being model description or analogy of how to sort of understand it best. Dr. Clinton Schultz, who's a clinical psychologist and a Gamaroi man, he talks about, you know, the model being very much centered around the sense of self as the hub of a wheel. So outside of that central hub and self perspective, radiates out the spokes, which are all the domains of social emotional well-being, which, as well as our physical and mental health, it also includes our connection to community, family and kin, our connection to our culture and our country, and our connection to our spirituality and ancestry. And all those domains of our well-being interrelate and interconnect and make up our sense of self. We like to talk about ourselves as one mob, but we very much have a different cultural identity and different experiences. So I think the model really helps capture that. Influencing that sort of central hub and the spokes of the wheel being the sense of self and the domains of well-being is the outer rim of the wheel, which are all those structural determinants of health, the social, political, economic, and cultural determinants that sometimes can make that sort of rim of the wheel a little bit wobbly. And we know from the history of this country, for the impacts of colonization over the past 250 years or so, there is lots of structural issues, and it affects, us from a perspective of accessing health services through structural racism and discrimination, right through to, our economic circumstances, maybe not having the same levels of education, employment, and other social determinants of health. The final construct of this model on the outside of the wheel is all those expressions and experiences, which Clinton kind of talks about as the tire. And of course, you can have a wobbly wheel, and if you've also got a flat tire, the wheel can come off. And I think it's a really good analogy to look at that holistic sense of well-being that, differs a little bit from that mainstream model that really does pigeonhole mental health and physical health as different entities. The main take-home message we like to say about this social emotional well-being, as well as basing our WellMob website around it, is for practitioners and peer workers that are in the webinar here today. Just think about your service delivery. How can you deliver a more holistic service to your First Nations clients? How can you look at some of those other domains of social emotional well-being, particularly, culture as a connective and protective factor of our health? And how can you deliver that culturally safe care in your particular line of work? So to explain a little bit more about some of the truth-telling and history and determinants of our health, we thought we'd just show this short video. It goes for about 5 minutes, and it's called The Journey of Wellbeing. Just a bit of a content warning for our First Nations people out there that it does have references to intergenerational trauma, stolen generations. So you feel free to turn your sound down or off for the next 5 minutes while we play the video.
Imagine a line of well-being. When your spirit feels strong and the world feels good around you. Back in the day, Aboriginal people's well-being went up and down. But we've had a strong culture for tens of thousands of years. Then whitefellas arrived to take over the land. Seems they forgot to ask us. And so a process of dispossession began and continued. The taking or loss of land and home, of access to food. Many of us even had our language, our law, and our culture taken. It can break your spirit. Colonization brought years of control, shooting, massacres, poisoning, and disease. And later, they made policies based on breeding Aboriginal people to be white, smoothing the dying pillow. This led to the stolen generations, when children were taken away from their parents and loved ones. Imagine the amount of grief all those mums and dads of aunties, uncles, grandparents and grandchildren left behind. Those children away from their families and everything they knew. And it wasn't just that. All these basic rights were withheld. To marry, to keep your own earnings, because we were Aboriginal. Imagine everyone around you has gone through the same trauma. So just about everyone's well-being's probably gone down. The well-being of whole families and communities through generation after generation. The miracle is that our human spirit survives. Aboriginal people are strong. Slowly, those policies and practices began to change, so that today we are on this journey of healing and re-empowerment. So there's plenty of Aboriginal people with strong health and well-being, but there's still too many of us where life is hard. What we don't heal in our own life, it's really easy to pass on to our children. We need to talk about this. When you speak to people recovering from trauma, they'll say, "My loved ones were my rocks." Now, what if you and your rocks are crumbling? You try to grab hold and they fall back, bruising you, rather than helping you out. When there's been low well-being for many generations, there's high levels of violence, shortened lifespans, illness, high levels of substance abuse, alcohol, imprisonment. Too many of us are affected by suicide. So even if we had total justice today, a lot of our kids are born into this pit here. Kids living in traumatic environments may think the world is about flight or fight, instead of love and attachment. And this means they may get in loads of trouble or have trouble forming healthy relationships. So, all this trauma from those policies and practices echoes down through the generations, rather than getting better with time. Like I said, plenty of our mob are way up here, but we've got links down into this pit. We can spend our lives trying to pull people out, and it's really easy to get pulled back in. As an Aboriginal person, everyone expects you to be down there, and it can feel like a place you belong. So what we are dealing with is complex. We are all facing a massive challenge. Too many people think this pit is Aboriginal culture. And some of the ways we are dealing with this trauma is just sending people further into the pit. But we don't belong there. This is what happens when you systematically dispossess a people. We've got to think differently. Now, one thing we can do together is stand solid with the people up here. Change lies in the hands of strong and supportive Aboriginal role models in communities and organisations. When more Aboriginal people stand up here, and when the ground they're standing on is more solid, it will be much easier to break the cycle of low well-being, and we can pull more people out. We don't want you non-Aboriginal people to fix us up. We don't want rescuing, and we don't want protecting. But we do need you to walk alongside us. And we need you to see that this is shared Australian history. We want you to support our strength. We want you to listen and understand how those of us who've been caught in the pit got there. We want you to stand solid with our strong Aboriginal people as we heal and design our own solutions.
Thanks for taking the time to tune in with us. And I think it's really important to have these truth-telling videos which set the scene and the context of why Aboriginal people are overrepresented in some, chronic health and mental health disorders, and also just about our strength and resilience and the need for self-deterministic models. And this is an example of a resource you'll find on WellMob, and a great training resource to show for cultural competency training. So I'll hand it over to Mim to talk a little bit more about the WellMob website and some of the other resources on there. Thanks, Mim.
Thanks, Dave. So WellMob came into existence a number of years ago as a result of some discussions and consultations with First Nations workers, frontline workers, who were saying, look, it's really hard work trying to find resources that we can use when we're working with our people. Wouldn't it be good if all those resources were together in one place? And so hence, there it is. That's how WellMob actually got developed. And so these discussions, and then the WellMob website was actually developed in consultation with frontline workers in 3 different locations. So there's been a lot of input from around the world, from around Australia, from key workers. So we've got another little video to show you what WellMob is, and it just takes about 3 minutes. So if you could play that.
WellMob is a website to help our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mob stay mentally strong and feel deadly. It's a digital library of online wellbeing resources made for mob from all over the country. WellMob is developed by and for our mob and brings together the holistic concept of social and emotional well-being to build connections to our stories about land, spirituality, and ancestry. Search under the main topics relating to mind, body, mob, culture, keeping safe, and healing. Or go to our training tab for health and wellbeing workers. Whether you're a health or community worker or just one of our mob, the WellMob website is your one-stop shop for digital wellbeing tools. WellMob makes it easy to search for apps, websites, podcasts, documents, social media, and videos that help our wellbeing. And it's not just about mental health. It captures our stories to connect us to country, culture, and our diverse communities. It's that easy. Search WellMob. Watch, listen, and learn about our Indigenous ways of holistic mental health and well-being. Go to wellmob.org.au and show your support with a like, follow, and share. These are the homes of ancestral spirits, and WellMob walk lightly with gratitude and respect.
So in summary, the WellMob website now has over 500 resources that we actually gather from across all of Australia. So there's a whole array of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations that produce resources, and we draw them into WellMob. The target audience is actually frontline workers, but of course, because it's freely available 24/7, it's also available to community members at any time. Okay, so as the video actually showed, there are a number of different ways of actually searching for WellMob, through WellMob for resources. I think we've gone too far. Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
This is the one we need. And so as we saw, there are 6 main topic tiles. And if you click on any of the topic tiles, you will see a number of subtopics. So you can see, for instance, we clicked as a demo on the body, and you'll see that you can get further into those resources by looking at grog, drugs, sleep, sniffing, smoking, eating well, and being active. If you were to click on the mind tile, then there would be subtopics such as strong mind, sadness, worry, suicide, grief, self-harm. And for instance, if you wanted to, in response to some of the questions that we received prior to the webinar, if you clicked on the drugs subtopic tile, it will list all of the resources that we have around drugs. And it's organised according to the date that it was actually published. And then within each year, it's actually in alphabetical order. So it's pretty easy to find those resources. But of course, the Cracks in the Ice resource is brilliant, and we think it's got so many fantastic resources, so we'd encourage you to do that. There was also a question about, do we have resources for young people? And yes, if you clicked on the Our Mob tile, then there is a young people subtopic tile, and that lists all of the resources that we have for young people. Somebody else also asked about working with families. Again, under the Our Mob tile, we've got a parenting subtopic tile, and that lists a whole lot of resources that you can use when you're working with families. Okay, so if you land on our landing page, if you're actually looking at a computer, you'll see this bar called Shortcuts to Top Resources, and Dave will talk in a little bit more detail about that, but that is an important step for you to remember. Then you'll see in the top of the right-hand corner a little magnifying glass, which is actually a search bar. On a mobile phone, you would need to scroll down to the bottom more or less of the landing page, and then it has a search bar there. So you can insert anything that you like, and we'll do a demo around that shortly, so that you can really search very specifically on a particular topic. And as the video showed, you can also search by clicking on apps, websites, audio or podcasts, documents, social media, and videos. Let's have a look at a client scenario as a way of looking for young resources. So in this particular scenario, Natalie is a 20-year-old young woman. She is using amphetamines. She grew up in foster care. She's living in a domestic violence relationship, and she wants to set goals for a better life. Now, that's a pretty complex situation. And we're assuming that the worker is going to work on a whole array of things and build a relationship with her. But let's then look at the goal setting. And so what resource around goal setting might actually be useful? If we type goals into the search bar, then they'll come up with about 12 different resources. And the two resources that I've picked out here may be really useful to work with Natalie. The nice thing about searching together with a client in your room is that you can actually have a look at all of the resources together and to see which one might be better for them. So, for instance, the Stay Strong Care Plan, this is an 8-page document that you can actually download and print off, and it takes you through a range of questions, very much around a holistic view that includes cultural factors. And it might actually be a very nice way of getting to know your client, because in terms of the broader context, because it asks questions such as who else is in their life, what keeps them strong, what undermines their strengths, etc. So that's one particular resource. The other one is that we've got listed here is the Journey to Your Self-Healing book. And in our analytics that we get every month about who's actually downloading what, this keeps on being one of the top resources that gets downloaded. And it's something that can be printed off. And it's a guide and a kind of like a diary where you can create monthly goals and plans and lists, and includes recipes, well-being tips, affirmations, but it also allows people to list who their appointments are with. Again, if we're thinking about Natalie, then other ways in which you might actually be searching for resources is to click on the mind tiles, and particularly the strong mind, or there might be body and looking at drugs, Our Mob and young people, Our Mob and women, culture and young people, keeping safe family violence. So there's resources that may be useful under all of those headings.
Thanks, Mim, and thanks, Raquel, for sharing that video link in the chat for the Journey to Wellbeing. Now we've had a bit of a look at how you might enter the WellMob website and some of the various methods of finding a resource. We just thought we'd play a quick video to sort of show you how some of the things you might need to think about as a practitioner or a health worker before you go using a digital resource or WellMob, and some of the applications of WellMob if you've got a client-centered role or a health promotion role. So I'll let the video do all the talking.
WellMob is the go-to website for health and community workers to find culturally relevant digital resources. These resources aim to support our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to maintain a healthy mind, body and spirit In this video, we will look at how you can use the resources on WellMob when working with First Nations people. Start by getting familiar with the website. Have a click around to get to know the topics on the site that you can use in your work. WellMob has resources on a range of wellbeing topics with easy take-home messages. It might be a website with culturally appropriate parenting tips, a video talking about how alcohol or drugs affects our mind and body, or an app that allows us to check in with how our clients are feeling. When introducing WellMob resources to your client, assess their wellbeing needs as you build rapport. How comfortable are they with using technology? What are their interests? What makes them feel strong? These sorts of questions will help when it comes time to find resources that are appropriate for that individual. For example, I might provide a young person with a YouTube video, while Uncle might prefer a printable fact sheet with large print. When talking with a client about digital resources, go through it together, step by step. This helps clients understand what it's about and how they can use the resource. Check in regularly to follow up how they went, and then try another resource. But remember, using digital wellbeing resources is different for everyone. Some people might prefer to do short exercises with you in session, others might like to take them away to use in their own time. Match resources to their unique needs. WellMob can be a great addition to any health or community workers toolkit. Visit wellmob.org.au, like, follow and share.
It's always a bit of a shame job listening to that voice. I always forget I'm about to hear my own voice, but thanks for bearing with us on. That's a great little video that can be found on the landing page of WellMob, along with a couple of other videos, how to navigate the website, and just the first video we saw about what is WellMob, and that's kind of tips for workers. So some of the key messages there, we just thought we'd quickly reiterate that it's really important that we don't just assume that our First Nations client or the person we're supporting will use online content. You know, we've got to check everything from their tech savviness to their ownership of a device, and whether they wish to look at online content. So it's really important to sort of establish that up front with the workers who are online here with your client. In searching for a resource, Mim showed us some really easy ways to search, and we're going to talk about an even easier way by listing some of the best resources on WellMob in some of our resource sheets for workers. But it's really good to spend some time yourself to get familiar with maybe one or two or three resources that relate to your role and maybe some of the common issues, just so you've got confidence to be able to share them in session or to leave them with your client to use them in between consults. I really like the message in there about matching the resource to the situation and the person. You know, as it said, age is a real determinant. Some of our young people really love multimedia and they love video-based narratives, where our elders, they might prefer a printable fact sheet. So be conscious of how the information can be best absorbed. And finally, there was a little tip in there about sharing resources. If you go onto a resource page on WellMob, you'll see a little envelope in the top right corner, which looks like an email, and you can click on that and it will pop up in your email browser, so you can email it directly to your client if they've got email. So just a couple of little tips to reiterate from how to use WellMob in your work. So what I referred to before as another entry point to find some of the best resources on WellMob is some resource sheets we've developed specifically for workforce. And we've got about 20 resource sheets now, and they cover a range of common topics that our mob deal with. And here's a bit of a smattering of what they look like on the landing page for the resource sheets, which I'll get Steph to share in the chat. But generally, we know our workers are time poor, and we want to make it easy for them and save them time, and make it quickly accessible in a consult to go to one of the resource sheets on a key topic. Say it's around anxiety, and instead of being faced with 27 resources on anxiety, if you search under that topic, the resource sheet narrows it down to about 8 or 10 and gives you some of the best practice, culturally embedded and culturally safe resources to work with someone around anxiety. We always, suggest that you have a look at it beforehand and get familiar, as I said before, but it's something you can bring up on your desktop if you've got an office, or on your mobile technology, if not, and have a look at some of the resources with the client in session and see what might resonate with them and support them on their journey. Here's just 3 examples of what the resource sheets look like. They're essentially interactive PDFs. So all you need to do is click on those coloured bars and it'll take you straight through to the WellMob page for that resource. So again, we're trying to sort of make it quick and easy for workers, within 3 clicks, find the right resource. Just going from left to right on your screen, the cultural identity is one of our most popular resource sheets for workers. And we've actually got one for young people, adults and children. So there's 3 different ones with appropriate resources for those different age brackets. There's one on the middle there is the one we've just put out with some new resources on drugs. We used to have that combined with alcohol. So there's a separate one for alcohol. So some great resources, including the cracks in the ice resources. And I really suggest you have a look at for people who are supporting some mob through using methamphetamine or other drugs. There's a great webpage on the Cracks in the Ice website that talks about the signs of someone using and some of the ways you might be able to support them in looking at their use. And finally, on the right-hand side of the screen, we've got one there on racism, which has got some really good resources. As a non-Indigenous practitioner, you can work with your First Nations client to help them respond to possible racism. We always think about those overt forms of racism, racial slurs and slander, etc., and online abuse, but it goes far beyond that interpersonal racism, and we've got some resources there that around those other forms of less obvious institutional, systematic, and structural racism that our community experience, and often that can be at the services that you might be working at. We've got to acknowledge that sometimes it's the first barrier for our people to come in and access health practitioners is if they don't feel safe going to a health service. So making sure people acknowledge some of that sort of history that we might bring with us and make people feel welcome and practice some culturally safe care by looking at that holistic model of social emotional wellbeing care. So Mim, let's have a look at some of the training resources that we've put together on WellMob to also make it easier for workers.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So if you go onto the landing page on a computer, you'll see up the top it's called training resources. If you click on resources, it comes up to training resources. And then if you actually click up on that, and on a mobile phone, there's 3 little bars on the right hand side, and you need to click on that and then get into the training resources. What we've done is we've organised the well over 200 resources that we have now in under 9 subtopic tiles, similarly to the actual other content tiles. So how to use digital resources. So there's some lovely resources there which will just remind you about how to use them really well. Impact of colonisation. As a non-Indigenous worker myself, I would encourage all non-Indigenous workers to have a look at those resources just to educate yourself. I thought I was pretty well informed, but since I've been working in WellMob, I've learned so much more, just partly by being one of the people who reviews all the new resources coming through. The same for social and emotional wellbeing. So really important that we understand incredibly well what that framework actually looks like, and there's some fantastic resources on there. A couple of them are actually, they say that they're for First Nations workforce, but in actual fact, as a non-Indigenous worker, I'd encourage you to dive into those as well, because there's some really great explanations of what each of those domains means and how you might ask questions, etc. There's a great little topic called self-care, which also talks about workplace wellbeing. And whilst it's targeting our First Nations workforce, really, I think there's some resources in there that are relevant for all of us. Best practice ideas. There's a very long list of best practice ideas, and we are about to try and organise an easier way to navigate those. But one of the ones that I'd really encourage you to have a look at in there is about being an ally. to your colleagues and to the people that you're working with. Then there's trauma-informed care, which is really about us understanding more about trauma-informed care in the context of intergenerational trauma. And then there's another grab bag of general. So I'd really encourage you very strongly to have a look at those. And obviously the resource sheets will actually shorten the journey through to have a look at what the best ones are that we've got at any one time. However, we only update those on a once-a-year basis, so there's always new resources coming in.
Thanks, Mim. And it was great that you mentioned the allyship content. And Mim's actually written an amazing blog that's on our e-mental health and practice website if you go to the blogs. Just saying about all the practical things that Mim has done both as a practitioner and as a worker in a mainly Indigenous team at WellMob. And I think, more and more of our non-Indigenous allies in the health workforce are reaching out for content to how they can walk alongside us and support us in our health journey and how they can make their service culturally safe and trauma-informed. So just to recap before we go to some questions, so hang in there. We'd love to hear some more questions in the chat. But hopefully we've given you a bit of an understanding of the social emotional wellbeing model if you hadn't come across it before, which I'd be surprised, how that differs to a mainstream model of mental health and Western mental health care. We've looked at the WellMob website that's based on this social emotional wellbeing model and pulls in some of that cultural content, some of that grey material that helps us understand other people's journeys through a narration, whether it's a podcast or a video or a social media post. Really important that our mob really gravitate towards story and learning from other people's experience of getting through adversity, as well as some of that strength-based content that tapping into our language and our dance and our culture and our story. They're the sort of things that can be really protective factors in our health and healing journey. You can find WellMob at wellmob.org.au, and just remember those resource sheets for workers that dilute some of the best content there on those common topics, some of which we explored. We'll love you guys to follow us either through social media. We've got a Facebook and Instagram account, and we've also, in that QR code, that'll take you through to a Linktree webpage, which has got some of these blogs that we're talking about and some of the other content that we've generated alongside some of our allies and some of our Aboriginal health workers. So feel free to have a look at that in the chat and click on it, or use your phone to QR. So now we'd like to have a look at some of the questions that were submitted by people during the registration process. And I kind of themed them because there was about 20 odd questions, and there was a lot of common threads there that I thought would be useful to explore. The first one that kind of Mim touched on already around that Our Mob tile on the topic on the landing page. We have content for specific cohorts or groups under that Our Mob tile. So we've got stuff for elders, women, men, young people, parents, etc. So if you have a look at that topic when you've got a chance, and great place to go when you're looking for specific resources for a specific age group or a specific subpopulation. The other thing around harm minimization and use, we have got under the body tab, as Mim demonstrated, the drugs and the alcohol, as well as one on inhalants. So really useful to go to specific topics for those particular substances. But again, the Cracks in the Ice is a fantastic website for resources around methamphetamine, and the Positive Choices website, of course, that's run by the Matilda Centre, also here at University of Sydney. That's a fantastic resource. That's still my go-to, and the one I advocate to workers and young people that I talk with around getting informed around drug and alcohol use. I think it's got really well put together, and it's culturally embedded and safe, and really has some great plain language resources to explain to young people around making positive choices around alcohol and other drugs. Finally, content for workforce, in particularly non-Indigenous workforce, and providing trauma-informed and culturally safe care. As we've demonstrated, the training resources tab, and under that you'll see trauma-informed care as well as social and emotional wellbeing topics. So if there's any questions in particular, feel free to, that we haven't already addressed, feel free to put them in the chat, or Steph, I haven't been monitoring the chat too closely. Let me know if there's something that is a bit different to that. We really appreciate the time to talk about WellMob, and you know, our biggest take-home message is check out the resource sheets. If we don't have a lot of Q&A coming through, we'd love to play another little short video which demonstrates, it's a bit of a montage of a few videos that we put together from different workers in different roles about how they use WellMob, and I think it demonstrates just the diversity of places and roles that you can use online resources.
Question there about vaping.
Oh yeah, vaping. Do you want to talk to that?
Sure. So yes, a question's just come up about young people in vaping. There's been some fantastic resources developed in the last 12 months or so. If we do actually have a resource sheet on vaping, and you can also go into the smoking subtopic tile for body. So they're two places to go. There's a question about how do you decide what resources you include on WellMob? Well, first of all, it has to kind of fit with the social and emotional wellbeing framework. We get a range of resources sent to us through the by the Australian Indigenous Health website. And we always review those, but they have to be practical and they have to be usable. And now that we've got so many resources, we're being a little bit more discerning about how useful those resources are. And then we review them on a regular basis. So, and then of course, what happens when we update our resource sheets is that we then we have a worker who's brilliant at researching, and she's found heaps of other resources from various websites that we then include.
We also had another question.
Yeah.
How do you think non-Indigenous people can learn from an Indigenous model of care?
Oh, I think it's fantastic. I think the holistic model should be used all of the time for anyone who presents to a health service. I've always thought that, and so you know, it was really exciting for me to actually come here and learn more specific about social and emotional well-being. But it's so relevant for everyone, like all of us. If non-Indigenous workers who are struggling with poverty or not able to access decent housing. There's a whole lot of if you're not white, then you can experience lots of racism. So I think it's incredibly relevant for any person. But what we need to be really mindful of is that when we're working with mob, then we need to be really up on all of that. I think the other thing is that we need to, as non-Indigenous workers, we need to be really aware of the history. And although some people say, well, it's time to move on, that's all well and true. But I think the animation that we showed at the beginning of this presentation shows how hard it is to actually move out and how much work needs to happen from all of us to enable that to happen.
And for our non-Indigenous practitioners out there, if you really want some practical understanding of how you might apply a social emotional wellbeing model to work with Aboriginal people and families, Emerging Minds have some really good online content where you can register for free and complete an online module, which takes about 45 minutes to an hour and a half, the couple that I'm thinking of. But they're really great. They've got some embedded acted scenes about a practitioner working in a strength-based and holistic social emotional wellbeing process with some Aboriginal parents. So it just gives you a really good understanding of what it might look like, as well as, you know, look at some of the resources on our understanding social emotional wellbeing resource sheet.
There was a question that slipped out of my awareness now about domestic violence resources, and yes, there are resources. So again, if you have a look at the Our Mob and then Women, there's quite a few there. There's also some really excellent resources under the Keeping Safe tab. And then there's, and that person also said, and what do we need to be mindful of? I think what we need to be mindful of, as that animated video showed, is that if you've had so much happen to you, then there's a whole lot of stuff that also just comes, because that's what happens for people in those lives. So be aware that people who perpetrate domestic violence in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, that they have experienced a whole lot of trauma, and that I think women in those communities don't just want them to be removed from there or to be thrown in jail, but that they actually want to have a look at more holistic responses to the experience of violence. Do you want to comment too, Dave?
Yeah, and I think for you know, I guess let's name the elephant, like men that sort of often the perpetrators of family violence. And I think it's really important to think about, as Mim said, the colonization and its impact on our culture. Our culture was not violent towards women ever. And it's really about reconnecting with our culture and our law, our LORE, and our understanding of how women are, you know, part of our culture. And we talk about mother as our, you know, the essence of our culture. And so being respectful and having a relationship with our culture will mean we're going to be respectful and have a better relationship with the people in our lives. So I think it's really, for me, it's a plug for self-determined programs around our men reconnecting with their culture and having a better grounding in some of the things, the nurturing things that we have been taught, and sometimes, you know, we might have forgotten or haven't been role modeled because of the impacts of colonization over the last 250 years.
Yeah, thanks, David and Mim. Sorry, if I just wanted to kind of touch a little bit more around the trauma angle, because as we know, mental health and trauma and drug and alcohol use all overlap, and you shared that fantastic resources around like understanding the impact of trauma. Do you have sort of any top tips about, you know, how do you approach it with a client? Like, how do you not overwhelm them or make assumptions when you're kind of in that situation? Like, how can you start a conversation and a story with someone?
Yeah, listen, like, I'm not a practitioner, I'll say that up front, but my sort of own personal journey with helping brothers and uncles through tough times, I really think it's that model of tapping into your strengths first, you know, like looking at your strengths and then looking at maybe where some of those deficiencies are in your life that might be why these things are playing out. And you know, some of the resources that Mim shared earlier, the Menzies School of Health Research Stay Strong Care Plan, or the Stay Strong app that you can download for free, they're really good tools to be able to sort of step through a process of saying, you know, what keeps you strong and who keeps you strong. You know, starting off with that strength-based approach as opposed to that, you know, deficit language we often go to, then looking at some of your worries and some of your concerns and some of your issues. And the great way I like to then turn those resources into proactive action is, you know, that whole goal setting stuff that we talked about when we looked at Natalie as a case study in this webinar, how we can actually work on, you know, some of the key goals. We want to rectify those things that maybe aren't going so well in our lives and how they might interplay, and then break it down into some real tangible steps and SMART goals where we're, you know, they're specific and measurable and achievable, and they're timely. So we can actually sort of have little baby steps towards our key goals and journeys, and then use those sorts of resources as something to reflect on and see how you're going, you know, particularly as practitioners, like checking in with a client and saying, okay, you've set these goals and you've talked about who and what keeps you strong, and these are some of your worries. Let's just, every session, let's revisit this.
As a clinician in the past, quite some time ago now, but I think, and thank you for the person who asked that question, but about reminding us about the trauma-informed care, which is really important. But as a clinician, I think it's very much about making sure that we work as a collaborative team. So yes, as a clinician or as a worker, you bring a whole lot of experience and expertise and perspectives, but be really aware that that person is the authority on their lives, and so that we don't make assumptions that just because some things have worked with some people, particularly in a sort of non-Indigenous context, that we assume that they'll work in the other context. So it's always about being collaborative, checking in, and working side by side. There was another question that came up about resources for children in out-of-home care. On the landing page, when you go down to the bottom, there are some testimonials, and we've got one set of testimonials from a couple of First Nations women who are working in that out-of-home care space, and about what they particularly like. And what they talk about is the importance of checking in with young people who are in out-of-home care about their understanding about identity, and particularly cultural identity, and to what extent that has been possible for them. And then we've got some great resources around all of that. But if you're a non-Indigenous person working in that space, then I think it's really important to get some advice from the local Aboriginal people about how to approach that whole thing about cultural identity, because, you know, it's not appropriate for us to take the lead on that, but it is important for us to know that those resources are there, and whether it's appropriate to connect with a First Nations worker or some leaders in the community or some elders or whatever.
I think that's really good message, Mim. I was going to mention it before when you were talking about trauma-informed care. I think taking things back to your elders and local communities is really important as non-Indigenous practitioners. And whether you're fortunate to work in an Aboriginal community controlled service, and if not, you know, having some form of cultural governance and check-in to be able to say, hey, these are the issues we're facing in the community. What sort of guidance can you give us to how to deal with them? So I think local solutions, you know, are always important to talk about in these spaces.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess one thing about, you know, I really love the messaging that you had around walking together, and it being sort of a collaborative effort. I know that sometimes non-Indigenous people like myself can sort of feel a bit frightened that we'll say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. And it's really comforting to see resources like this that can give us some tips and pointers. And I just wanted to kind of get your reflections around, like, in your experience when, you know, sometimes the communication has gone wrong or things have been said that weren't intentionally meant, like, what kind of steps do you sort of think are best in sort of repairing relationships and getting back onto the same page?
Look, I think if you're not very experienced working with First Nations clients, then say so at the beginning and say, look, I'm really keen to work collaboratively with you. If I say something that is a bit out of line or that shows my ignorance about something, please let me know, because I'm wanting to learn, and I'm wanting to learn from you to work together. And what everyone tells me, all the First Nations people tell me, is that they don't mind if we make mistakes. What they want to know is that we're open to hearing about the mistakes that we might have made. And that we go, oh, okay, thank you so much for telling me about that, and how can I now move forward with you so that we can continue to do the work together. So, you know, I think, yes, it's understandable that we all feel a little bit anxious, but I think if we say right up front, I'm not very experienced at this, and even if you are, you could still get it wrong, because every situation is different. And indeed, what I used to do in my clinical work with non-Indigenous workers is I'd be checking in with them on a regular basis and to say, is the work that we've done today, is that useful? And are we heading in the right direction? And if you hear me going in a direction that doesn't work for you, just say so. But they may need to be reminded about that several times, because they wouldn't be used to being in a clinical situation where they're given that amount of agency.
I agree, Mim. I think that reflective practice and communicating that with your First Nations client and just checking in is really important, whether you're using digital resources and you're checking in if that's useful or not, or whether it's just around, you know, the type of care and support you're providing. So I think it's really good messaging.
Yeah, thanks both. I know that that's a common question we get about, you know, how can I be a better ally? How can I make sure that I'm doing the absolute best work that I can for my clients?
Thanks for asking the questions.
Of course. Tariq, I think there was another question.
Yeah, there was a question about do resources exist for sexual violence?
We under the healing tab, I'm pretty sure we have got, keeping safe tab, we have got some content there around sexual violence and how there's some great, I know there's a great podcast, and there's also a young person's resource. I think it's an animate or a PDF cartoon that sort of unpacks what sexual violence might look like, because we know, informed consent is so important, particularly with our young people, to understand what that means. And there are better resources coming out, but I would clearly say it's a resource gap that still needs to be filled. And particularly in the First Nation space, I think we need to have more yarns and conversations and translate some of the thinking and knowledge around sexual violence, and that it's important to speak out if you're feeling unsafe.
Well, we might have time if you would like to still play those videos.
Okay.
Yeah, it's only a short one, and we just think it's a great way for practitioners and workers to understand some of the different ways that WellMob can be used. And feel free, if anyone's keen, to record a small video about how they might use WellMob now they're more across it, because we'd love to just do an online screen recording. It might take an hour, and get your perspective on using some of the content we provide. So here's a montage of some of the workers that we've managed to record.
Use WellMob to show people a video that's relevant to their situation, to find a fact sheet and print it out, or even better, email them the fact sheet, which you can do directly from the WellMob site.
The one that I use most for my patients would be the women's part of the website. I really like that there's access to the Facebook group for the women, that there's stuff to do with trauma, which is really important, especially for my women who are pregnant.
And if you have a look on the website, there are some great topic areas that you can start to explore and look around with these resources in mind. Mental health, worries, suicide and self-harm, gambling, eating disorders.
I use the tiles more often than not for, the particular thing that I'm searching, and then go from there. And I've found that's the easiest way for patients as well.
People are really smart and actually want to find out information for themselves, and are able to do that with WellMob.
On the website, they're all categorised. There's great search functions, so there's pretty quick and pretty effective way to find Indigenous resources for the person that you're working with.
There's so many amazing resources on there in one spot that you won't even have to think about it. You will literally be able to provide your patient with quality, culturally appropriate care, and they will be so grateful for it.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure. Thanks for having us on
Yeah.
The webinar, and thanks for all the love in the chat room, and really appreciate people having a look at WellMob and using it as much as you can. And if you've got any resources we don't have on there that are First Nation specific, please let us know. There's a contact form on the landing page you could send it through to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dave and Mim, for presenting for us today. Yeah, unfortunately, that's all we have time. But yeah, apologies to anyone who didn't have their questions answered. You're more than welcome to get in touch with us with email, and we'll respond to any questions or inquiries as soon as possible. We will be holding more webinars and putting new resources on Cracks in the Ice throughout the year, so I would encourage you to subscribe to our mailing list at cracksintheice.org.au to receive further updates. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.